Welcome to Scholarly Soundbites, where we discuss complex issues in terms of its clarity and innovation, and then make it more accessible to people through having more digestible chunks of discussions between academics and other professionals in the field. I'm Kaushik, the host for the show, and together we'll be exploring different journeys of different scholars and academicians, as well as practitioners in their quest to learn more and do more in the greater end of doing things for science society and other fields. Today we are joined by Palaash Bhargava, who is a developmental and labor economist from Columbia University. His research spans a lot of different domains which we are very excited to be discussing today. Some of them include educational outcomes focusing on addressing social isolations in school, and other innovative projects including deskmate assignments and having transitioned into other fields from, say, NYU in Abu Dhabi, where they were teaching. We will find that as part of our discussion as well, which would be very intriguing for the listener and very informative as well. So, Palash, very warm welcome to the podcast. Very glad to have you on board. If you want to just have a few words about who you are and what do you do, so that we can also have an idea about what defines you as a person.
I mean, that's a loaded question, Kaushik. Thank you so much for inviting me. Very glad to be here. So, as you mentioned, in your description of my research profile and my profile in general was very apt. I am right now a PhD candidate at Columbia University, but soon to finish. So, probably heading to some other university right after as an assistant professor or in a research role. I broadly work on education networks, and I'm a development and labor economist, but my interests also span topics such as culture, economic history, and household finance.
That's pretty interesting. So, when I was going through a bit of research and planning out the podcast, I looked at a couple of early experiences you had at NYU Abu Dhabi and which led to you pursuing your PhD. So, what do you think drew you to do that? And then what made you transition into doing a PhD at Columbia?
I mean, quite honestly, I was always interested in pursuing research as a career, but I also wanted to test my opportunity cost. So after I finished my master's at Delhi School of Economics, I actually worked as an investment banker with Nomura for a year. And then I realized that I like research a lot more in comparison to investment banking, and that sort of made me shift more towards an academic profile. And so luck would have it, I basically got an offer from NYU Abu Dhabi at that point of time, where they gave me this option to come and teach with them, but also carry out research projects and start long term associations. And the 2 years that I spent there, with a brief stint at NYU Shanghai, sort of solidified the idea that I really like research and I would probably want to make a career out of that. And then the immediate next step was basically pursuing a PhD. And that sort of brought me to Columbia.
Pretty fun. So, I think the most important thing that you laid down there was that you were in investment banking. So, suddenly transitioning from investment banking would have been a different thought process for you. So, what was that pushing point, or what was the tip over point for you?
I mean, quite honestly, if you think about the way we approach questions or topics that interest us, the underlying theme is just curiosity, right? The reason why I joined investment banking to start off was that was a new domain and I'd never tried that. And I'd actually interned at Nomura when I was at Delhi School of Economics. And I kind of liked what I did and I wanted to explore that further. And I did that. And after a point of time, I realized that maybe my preferences, broadly speaking, are more aligned towards public policy than finance. And that was the reason why I kind of shifted more towards academia, because that's where the true substance lies. And that's where you can make headway in terms of thinking about new projects, new ideas, new topics.
So, do you believe that there's a big difference for people transitioning into academia from, say, such technical roles like in investment banking and Nomura, as you would have had a very different profile? Do you think there's a big jump that people need to take when they're going into academia?
Not really. I know of a lot of people who actually, once they finish their undergrads or postgrads, kind of experiment in the industry. And a lot of times it's actually super helpful because people working in the industry are at the forefront of topics and challenges that we're trying to find solutions for. So the idea that you end up working in an industry or like in a corporate setup exposes you to a bunch of things that actually inform your research topics later on. In my case, that happened very remotely because I still work on household finance, but not so much. But the idea is that an experience in the broader sector, say corporate sector, also gives you an idea of what your opportunity cost lies or what your opportunity cost has to be. Because these are long term investments, right? You basically end up for a PhD for 6 years. and you need to evaluate whether that is the right choice in comparison to something else that you could have done in those 6 years in your life.
Pretty interesting. So I think even when you're transitioning out from, say, undergraduate, you're very confused about what roles to take. So I think that will also be a very big decision factor as you experience something, learn more about how the world is operating and different profiles are operating for you, and then sort of take a chance into doing something which is much more settled for you. But then I think if the listeners were attentive, they would have learned that you've done your undergrad from, and or postgrad, if I'm not wrong, from DSE, and then you've gone into, say, from India to Abu Dhabi and then to New York. And all three have very different cultural contexts as well behind your research and your work. So, how do you think transitioning between these different cultural settings changed you as a developmental economist? Because, of course, as a mode of development, all of the three countries are on a very different index. Index in the sense, I am broadly using this term as not that educated in terms of developmental economics, but sort of like in layman's ways, in very different stages of development rather. What do you think would be your perspective looking into this?
I mean, I did not think about it too much, but you're spot on in terms of thinking about how Abu Dhabi or UAE, US, and India are very different in terms of its cultural setup, or for that matter, even the development and growth trajectories that it has seen. The interesting thing, though, is that you're now in a world where you're not only working and talking with Indians, or for that matter, if I'm in the US, I'm not only working and talking with Americans. On an everyday basis, you're talking to people who are sitting in France, you're talking to people who are sitting in China, you're talking to people who are sitting in Latin America. And as luck would have it, or as careers generally progress, on an average, individuals do tend to move around a lot. And the more global we become as a society or as an economy, the chances of you experiencing different cultures is going to be much higher. And that was the case in my, or that was the situation in my case, which was I just happened to stumble across an opportunity in Abu Dhabi, really liked it, moved there, enjoyed that a lot. While being there, also got some exposure in China, enjoyed that a lot. And then most of the great universities right now, which are producing nice PhD students and good research, are unfortunately situated in the West. So the immediate move then was towards the West. But this sort of informs you about different cultural aspects, and that feeds into your work because you can have a more holistic approach about how you're dealing with topics, how you're dealing with questions that arise, and you can learn from different cultures in order to find the right solutions.
I mean, that's spot on, right? Because if you're just transitioning into a next segment as well, when you're talking about your academic work, I think the world being more globalized has changed the perspective of academicians as well in terms of how they're approaching their research, because it has made it much more accessible to them. Though there are still a couple of barriers that are still there, as you mentioned, in terms of the West East divide or the global South and global North, as they refer to it. um, I think that is also a very important reason why we are taking forward with this decision, right? In terms of how we are discussing different aspects of your work, so that there is more, say, understanding about what you do, and more people can transition into this if they choose to do so. But this leads into a very interesting part of the next segment, where we talk a bit more about particularly what you have done in your research. Let's just start off with me giving a bit of background as to how I know you. I worked with you in terms of one project that you were part of in terms of socionomy, which you were doing as part of your PhD work in Colombia. I think that majorly helped me understand your work a bit more, and also made me understand how research works in such markets like India, where education is a very different prospect from, say, in France or, say, in the US. So how do you think your paper addressed, or your approaching paper in terms of your PhD thesis approaches these aspects, like the differences in US, France, and India?
I mean, so you pick on a very interesting point. In my opinion, actually, the outcomes that we are sort of interested in now in 2024 or 2025 are pretty common across the board. So everyone is interested in academic outcomes and improving learning outcomes of students. But there is a common understanding amongst economists, amongst education folks, among sociologists that just improving marks is not enough, because when you think about human capital, a lot more things go into that. And by that, I mean there are things such as soft skills, socio emotional skills, your level of confidence, your level of optimism that sort of feeds into how you turn out to be a human, and the kind of access and opportunities that you may have in the future, and how you perform in the labor market. And one key thing over there is also how well connected you are and how strong your social networks are. Because as you may imagine, as I may imagine, as anyone sort of thinks about it, in today's world, networks matter almost for every single thing, right? And that was the starting point of the paper. And what we basically found out was that isolation and social isolation amongst kids, specifically loneliness, is a huge issue that's not only rampant in India, but it's rampant across the world. And resolving isolation in order to improve the outcomes of these kids, both in terms of socio emotional skills, but also mental health, can be costly. And one way of doing it costlessly is to utilize the classroom environment that individuals belong to. And that opens up this domain of something called peer effects that economists have been working on for a really long time. And that was the genesis of the paper, right? Because when we talk to teachers, they would basically say that we are pairing these isolated students with more popular peers or with other isolated students, and we're trying to improve their friendship networks. We're trying to improve their social emotional skills. We're trying to improve their classroom experiences so that they can do much better by utilizing the classroom environment that's at hand. But what really works is something that we do not know, right? And that is something that we wanted to test out. So what we did was, in India, we went into these classrooms and we used something like deskmate assignments, and we randomly matched individuals based on popularity measures. So we decided either we'll probably match isolated students with each other or with more popular peers, and see what kind of match is going to lead to better outcomes for these isolated students. Because the underlying theory is very simple. You can match somebody who's isolated to someone who's super popular. That can actually lead to better integration, that can lead to more friendship networks or better friendship networks, and that can also improve their outcomes. But at the same point of time, go back to your high school or middle school and think about how did you feel when somebody who you were sitting next to was doing very well socially or academically, right? There's a possibility that that actually makes you feel inadequate. And really, because of this feeling of inadequacy, you reduce your level of effort, and that actually stunts your development. And that's what we wanted to test out. And that's what we did. We basically found that, at least within the classroom, matching isolated students with each other is actually better for their outcomes because they don't feel inadequate by sitting next to someone who's doing much better than them. But when you're thinking about all of these things, you also have to think about the fact that within these classrooms, whenever you're making these desk mate arrangements or these plans, individuals are not only impacted by the person that they're sitting next to, they're actually impacted by the overall broad interactions that exist within the classroom, right? So if Kaushik and Palash are sitting together, that can have a direct impact. But at the same point of time, Kaushik 2.0 and Palash 2.0 might be sitting with each other, or someone else would be sitting with each other. And those interactions can inform or change the overall classroom environment. And that can have an independent impact. And what we found is that matching more isolated students with each other within a classroom actually comes at the cost of something called a negative externality, which is when you within the classroom match a majority of isolated students with more popular peers, what ends up happening is that you're changing the overall norm in the classroom and you're fostering overall interactions within the classroom, which sort of makes these networks more cohesive. But effectively, this means that you have something called equity efficiency trade offs, which is either you match all isolated students with each other and not make them feel inadequate, or you match a majority of isolated students with more popular peers and let the rest of the isolated students be matched to each other. But in that particular case, you're generating these classroom level gains, but they're also unequal because some of them are still feeling inadequate. But there are some others who are basically benefiting at their expense because they're gaining from this overall classroom level change, but also not feeling inadequate, and that sort of like leads to better outcomes. Long story short, the idea is that this kind of effect, when you're thinking about socio emotional skills, when you're thinking about social networks, it's not only pertinent to India. You can do the same thing in China, you can do the same thing in Turkey, you can do the same thing in Germany, you can do the same thing in US. And social isolation as an issue is super relevant and rampant across the world. And these changing of classroom environments is a quick and easy way of fixing social isolation, but you have to make nuanced decisions as an educator.
I mean, definitely there are a couple of things though that come out to you when you're speaking about social isolation, right? In the sake of not making this a social commentary, it's a very important gateway into the world as to how people are operating around these school systems and how parents and other individuals are there. So I think that is also something your research would have sort of touched upon. So do you think that there is a relevant cause for concern for other people in terms of the way that these networks have been identified by you, and then these problems have been identified by you, and that these things need to be rectified in a global scale of things, so that a lot less pressure is there on these students, because they're of course not mentally as capable of taking these pressures. So is there something in your research which highlights these things as well?
Again, the best way of thinking about this is, imagine you're sitting for an interview, right? And this interview is for a job opportunity. The person has vetted your CV, knows that you basically scored an 8.2 CGPA or a 10 on 10 CGPA. So academically, you're doing brilliantly well. But the person is not looking for another factor in the production function, right? They're also looking for teammates and colleagues. So the whole idea is that, are you more amicable? Are you approachable? Can you talk your way through an interview? Are you confident? Are you willing to exert effort? And all these different soft skills matter a lot. And there has been a bunch of qualitative evidence that kind of shows that people who are isolated at an early age tend to show deficiencies on all these different outcomes. And that's something that we basically replicated in our study. We actually were able to show that across India, say in 13 different cities where we carried out this experiment, isolated students within classrooms on an average would show deficiencies on all these soft skills that you can think about. Their classroom experiences are much worse in comparison to their peers, as a result of which they talk less to teachers, they talk less with their peers, they show deficiencies in terms of academic performance, but also these whole host of socio emotional skills. They're less optimistic, they're less trusting of the environment, they're less pro social, they're less confident, they're less competitive. And these things will bite, right? And that's exactly why we need to worry about social isolation rather than just saying that we need better connections or better networks. They have real world ramifications.
Very true. I think that also leads me into the next segment, right? When you're looking at these real world ramifications, there would have been a lot of like pressure on you to have done this in such a broad scale in India. Like parents would have had opposition, and implementing such a huge program in, say, a large scale intervention that you're doing in these education institutions would have its own challenges logistically. So, what do you think when you are looking at doing this, say, for some other project? Or if you're advising somebody else to do this or do that in another project which replicates some of the factors that you've spoken about in terms of implementing a program in multiple education institutions, what do you think you identify most as a problem when approaching these projects, and how do you think it's best to solve them?
So, the first thing that, if you're thinking about a career in development economics, broadly speaking, or public policy, one thing that is super important, and that should be a starting point, is to keep your finger on the pulse of the issue, which is you need to identify what the issue is so that you can propose the right remedies and carry out the right experiments in order to find solutions. If you understand what the issue is and you're able to communicate that to people who are involved on the field, teachers, parents, principals, or if you're doing this with firms, production managers, CEOs, then carrying out the experiment, carrying out a proposed implementation plan becomes easier. That's the first bit. The second bit is you need to be in tune with what's happening when the experiment is going on. And for that, you need a stellar team of research managers and assistants who understand what's going on, and there is open communication both between the research managers and the assistants, and also the places where these programs are implemented. That means sometimes there are teething problems, there are issues that pop up, but we think that these issues are much bigger than they actually are. So the whole idea is that if you are in constant communication and you've set up a channel of communication in such a way that all the issues are addressed at the right time, in the right moment, in the right way, then running these programs becomes easier. And of course, a lot of it then comes with experience, because once you've run multiple programs, you realize how to deal with situations. Because at the end of the day, it's not astrophysics where you're dealing with like moving particles, you're dealing with humans, and humans are complicated. And hence, trying to understand these social relations is super important, and navigating those social relations is important.
Definitely. I mean, any form of social connections you build in terms of, say, even in schools that you were discussing as part of your deskmate assignments, but also in terms of approaching colleagues and other peers in your industry or in other industries to do your work, it's very complicated, right? But another part of your research profile, you've done a lot of work in terms of database building and all. The first thing that came to me, or I noticed pretty evidently, was your work on databasing all of these notable historical figures, and you built like a million or plus database of these individuals. So what like drove you or motivated you towards doing this, and what were the outcomes that you were desiring, and what was the final thing that you got out of it?
I mean, this is a long project that we are still involved in. We've basically come out with the first paper, but there is a lot more that has to come. I think one of the key things that we probably think about as social scientists is that there's a dearth. I mean, there's this vast amount of information that's available out there, and we can utilize it, but it's not easily available to individuals. And one key component where you can learn a lot and figure out answers to questions that are super challenging is data from historical archives, right? So the project actually started out as an intellectual curiosity. We were just thinking about, look, people have been documenting history in one form or another. People have been talking about these influential figures and notable figures. Who are these notable figures? And like, how have the patterns changed over a period of time? And we realized that surprisingly, Wikipedia and different editions of Wikipedia and Wikidata are a fantastic source of collecting what gets retained in human memory, right? So we started collecting information about every single person who ever pops up on Wikipedia in any specific edition. And then we cleaned the data and we basically pruned it a little bit in order to construct this database of so called notable individuals that have been remembered by human history in the last 5,000 years. What can you do with this, right? So we wanted to test out a couple of things. One, we wanted to see whether the creation and formation of knowledge over the last 5,000 years have changed. It was happening in the east initially, then it sort of started moving towards the west, and we've been able to see that there is again a shift back towards the east. You can actually also think about things like, does the human race remember women and men in the same way when you're thinking about notability and history? And what we actually find is that there's a huge chunk of missing women in terms of notability. So all the women in our database are way more notable, which effectively means that on an average, if a woman is actually performing as good as a man, the chances of her being forgotten by human history is much higher. And then you can sort of track things like, you can show the rise of the age of Renaissance, or you can show wars by tracking changes in occupations and longevity of individuals. And the second part of the project that we are running right now is we are trying to construct information through large language models about where these individuals stayed during their life, and additionally, what did their social networks look like? Because this can open questions such as, what really is needed for a city to grow? Why did Paris become what it is in comparison to other cities that sort of died? Or what led to industrial revolution happen in Britain but not in France? And there is a whole idea about, well, connections mattered, but at the same point of time, when you're sort of thinking about city growth, you may require specific type of talent. So from, let's suppose you're a benevolent dictator and you're trying to design a city, do you want to attract Einstein first to your city so that everybody else follows, or do you want to attract a mass of local superstars that sort of build up the city, build up the amenities, build up the culture, and then the global superstars would probably follow to your city? And those are the questions that we're kind of exploring right now.
Just to make this a bit more fun, you would have come through so many names. Any fun names that you really, really stuck around with, or some notable figures that you really liked reading about?
Just for fun, if you're actually interested, just go and type on Google called notable people, and that would lead you to a map or a globe that was designed by Topi, who did a huge favor to us. So he basically picked up our database and put up all the famous people who have lived on this planet Earth in the last 5,000 years on the globe. And what you can do is zoom into your city and see in the last 5,000 years who is the most famous person that was born in your city, and what is your city actually remembered by. And people found this super interesting because things like figuring out that Keanu Reeves was actually born in Lebanon, not in the US, was a surprise to them. Or for that matter, there were debates about whether specific towns in UK are actually most known for these criminals that people had thought about that existed in like 1800s and 1900s. And people had a lot of fun in terms of thinking about what was their city most known for by the world.
It's
No
very
specific
interesting.
individual. Like, there's like you can figure out because it's always subjective, right? Like who do you think is the most notable
Yeah,
person? You can actually
definitely.
play around with your own.
I mean, it's a fun exercise. I'll definitely check it out later. I think one other thing that really struck me in this conversation was when you're talking about social mobility and understanding historical patterns, it's important that we understand how humans have transitioned over the ages. And when you brought out Renaissance and all the other things, something really struck me that we also know that there are a lot of historical figures who are very important in terms of conflict and in terms of other things. And my own work in, say, international relations and international law has led me to believe that there are a lot of chain and causal links for things happening. And I think I'm not really 100% sure where I read it, but everything is then connected to a chain, and then every subsequent link happens because of a previous link. And that was a wonderful take on how social mobility issues do present itself in the global world, right? Moving on, if you're looking at, say, parental borrowing in terms of how your work has panned out with Sandra Black, your research on, say, college costs and family finances, how could you see these key mechanisms that you discovered and elaborate a bit more in terms of how this research helped you progress as well?
I mean, I'll be happy to. So I think given that we sort of worry about financial health of individuals, specifically in the US, this particular project was kind of super important for us because if you think about college costs in the US, they're substantial. And one key thing that people have been debating about, at least in the policy framework, is whether we should give out loans to individuals, whether we should give out grants to individuals, and what's the impact of that on college completion, but also long run financial consequences for students. What we did realize was that there is a key component that's missing in this debate, and that's the impact of these grants and loans on parent health, parent financial health, right? Because going to college is often a joint decision. Students do want to go there, but it's often funded by their parents. So when you're thinking about these grants, when you're thinking about going to college, the impact of that does not only come towards students, it also come towards parents, and documenting that is super important. So the paper sort of has two different aspects. One is in general, how do parents prepare for college? And what we actually find super interesting is that parents tend to adjust their debt very well. And on an average, they don't tend to increase the amount of debt that they have when these kids go to college, despite college costs being super high. So they basically reduce their credit card consumptions and auto loans and things like that and shift towards student loans. And the second bit that we wanted to show was when you think about these grants, so for example, something like a Cal grant, or if you're in India, think about a random scholarship that you got. What people have been documenting is that the impact of these grants, at least in the US, on student financial health was none. And that sort of really opened up this discussion about whether we should give up these grants as well or not. And what we actually tend to show is that given that you don't see any movement on the student financial health, most of the movement actually happens on the parent financial health. So when these students get these grants, the parents are the ones that reduce their indebtedness, they reduce their chances of being delinquent on a particular loan, and in general, that sort of benefits them, which can have broader implications for the economy that you belong to.
That's pretty interesting. I think this conversation changes its perspective when you're looking at different developmental economies in comparison to developed economies. But also, I think the cost of tuition in the US is also a very important discussion point here. Though, for the sake of brevity, in our discussions, we can't really go into too much detail about that. But I think the major thing that came across to me when I was looking at your profile was the sheer amount of different interesting perspectives that you've had on different domains. So, for example, your work with climate experiences and ancestral climate experiences, which shapes different environmental attitudes. What did it lead to, and why did you take up environment all of a sudden in this domain?
I mean, I think the common theme in my research is actually networks. So if you think about the first set of things that we were talking about, it was all about social networks in school, right? How do social networks in school impact your behavioral traits? How do they impact your academic performance? So we have a bunch of RCTs that we are running over there. We have some projects in France. The second bit that we sort of talked about was family networks and household finance. So, given the fact that parents and kids kind of share resources, and when individuals are struck with positive or negative shocks, these shocks can percolate through family networks. Documenting that is super important. So, we do that in the context of cost of tuition, we do that in context of thinking about natural disasters and financial shocks emanating from natural disasters. And the third bit is actually ancestral networks, right? Because when you think about your ethnic ideologies and your ethnic identity, you go back to the time when your grandma was sitting with you right beside your bed and telling you lullabies. And you don't realize how much of how much those things can impact you. So the origin of this project was kind of interesting because I was sitting with my partner and we were talking about something random, and this topic came up, and we were talking about environment, and we were talking about why are some individuals very pro environment and why are some other individuals super anti environment, or like, let's not say anti environment, but they don't really care about climate change. And the idea was that she would basically say that I think my upbringing was such that I do care about environment a lot more. And that probed this idea, and we were like, okay, if that is the case, can we actually show this at a global scale? And we what we ended up doing was to match your ancestry based on the language that you speak at home to ethnic groups that existed way back in time, and then figured out that between 1600 to 1900, based on the location of these ethnic groups, what kind of climate conditions they faced. And what we showed was individuals that actually belong to whose ancestors actually belong to extremely unstable or extremely stable climates actually care a lot more about environment today, and there's a dip in the middle. And this is primarily driven by the fact that individuals whose ancestors belong to extremely stable climates actually realize the value of climate and environment, and they're worried that if there's more variation, then they may not be able to use it properly. And the individuals whose ancestors belong to extremely unstable climates are always worried about getting faced or like hit by a climate shock. So they care about a lot more about environment. But just to tie up this, given the fact that all of this was driven by the idea that maybe this is in our upbringing, we wanted to test this out with like ethnic folklore as well. And what we saw was ethnic folklore, which is effectively think about the stories that are being told to you as a kid, or the things that you talk about during a Thanksgiving break or with your family. Those also show the same kind of patterns, which is groups that belong to extremely stable or extremely unstable climates tend to have a lot more environmental representation in their folklore, and there's actually a dip in the middle. So, again, most of my work is driven by random curiosity that pops up, and we're like, hey, let's try this. Let's try to prove something. Some of them have real policy implications, others are more like, huh, did not think about it. Cool idea.
I mean, that's also something that a researcher needs to have, right? That hunger, that curiosity. Otherwise, they can't really sustain themselves in the field for a very long time. So I'm pretty sure that that's something which is a very good positive for you, because it keeps you engaged with your work as well and keeps you motivated to keep going that extra mile. But as you were talking about, say, historical antecedents to, say, climate narratives that we have in our homes, um, I suddenly remembered a couple of examples from my own childhood, right? Because when we had things like the Chipko movement in India, and then your grandparents or say your parents, if they were old enough to remember that, they have those discussions in the house that these are the environmental narratives that existed. But then also when you're living in places where there's constant torrential rain one day and then 40-degree weather with 80% humidity the other, and you're living in the face of extreme heat, you yourself have different lived experiences which you will transition into telling, say, the next generation about, like, you're a kid, you don't know what we lived through, please take care of the environment. So those kind of conversations do keep happening. And then that also led me to remember places like Kiribati, for example, where it's very prevalent, like in these countries where these small island nations exist, where they're in a constant threat of completely losing their entire nation. Their citizenry does not have any scope of retaining their identity or their homeland. And then that becomes such an important social narrative, which I had studied once upon a time as well when I was going through their stories as well. And also tribes like the Maori and others in different parts of the regions in the world, they all have their different domains and different cultural connotations towards the environment. So I think that is a very interesting take that you've taken here. But just the last part of your work that we'll be dealing with here. When you were working on your homophily project, how do you think this would have looked at in terms of social segregation that might have happened in schools, or when you're intervening in, say, these particular kind of situations, what narratives would you have? And possibly when you were also looking at your latest research in terms of the socioeconomy project that we discussed in the beginning, do these things also affect social mobility to a degree, and if so, what would your perspectives be on that?
I mean, if you're actually interested in social mobility, I would much rather suggest that you look at Rachetti's work and other co-authors that have worked actively on this particular domain. My project on like social networks and homophily, or for that matter, the social isolation project, was more about sort of thinking about once you become friends with people, do they impact you? And there are these intuitive ideas that we have a lot of times. And a lot of people actually, there's this open debate that are people inherently patient, or can their environment make them patient? In the same way, are people inherently pro-social, or can the environment actually make them pro-social? And the idea behind this was to say that one, birds of a feather flock together kind of thing. People of similar tendencies kind of attract each other and they become friends. But once you become friends, there is this whole idea that your friends can actually impact your outcomes. If you're thinking about this from a policy perspective, what this implies is, imagine if you want to change the prosociality level on an average within a particular group. If you have to go and give an intervention to every single kid or every single member of the society, that might be extremely costly. But if you do know that once you target one person or two people or three people, and then there are spillovers that happen, then that sort of reduces your intervention costs. So imagine if there is a person who is trying to really develop competitiveness, or really trying to develop aspirations amongst individuals, then maybe it might be a nice way of like sort of just tackling some individuals, giving them the intervention, and then letting social networks do their job. Because once you basically feed or like seed this idea, it'll diffuse and it'll basically benefit the community at large. So that was the motivation behind doing that homophily paper.
As we transition into this next segment, there's obviously a lot that we can learn from your work, and I think a couple of insights for our viewers would be nice. So, just beginning off, I think in your deskmate study, there were a lot of methodological insight that you would have gained. Right, for somebody who's doing this kind of research, what kind of design thinking would this researcher sort of need to have, and what kind of methodological insights would you like to give to them?
The reason why I learned a lot from most of the projects that I've done, and specifically the one with deskmate assignments, was the starting point was a very mixed method approach. It was me and one of my dearest friends, Tarang, sitting together along with another dear friend of ours, Chandraditya, and discussing what the issues existed and how can we potentially resolve it. And collecting information and processing this information required a lot of back and forth, a lot of brainstorming. And a bunch of it did not really come from my training as an economist, but it also came from the lived experiences that Chandraditya has had by working on the field, and the qualitative, brilliant mindset that Tarang sort of brings to the team. And the whole idea behind that was then, once we had identified the problem and potential solutions based on both discussions, qualitative interviews, and a little bit of like empirical analysis, then we leaned really heavily into standards, or for that matter, methods that economists rely on, and then ran an RCT. And in order to get experience, or for that matter, understanding how to run these experiments or how to utilize these methods, I would probably start small. I would try talking to people who have gained expertise in this particular area, get involved in projects in one form or another as research assistants or research managers or data collection individuals or enumerators, to understand what's going on, develop an understanding from there, and then start things on your own.
I think anybody who is getting into developmental economics would have maybe a wall in front of them where they would have been thinking, right, what to do, what not to do. And they would have identified some key challenges. But what do you think when people are going to be conducting field experiments? What are the key things that a student who is approaching this subject should be focused on?
Depends on what kind of training they've had. So the first thing that's super important is getting some experience under the belt by working with people. So work with people who are already running field experiments because they've seen what goes on, And there's a lot of learning on the job that happens. There are things like power analysis and power calculations and setting up the experiment and ensuring that you have funding coming through, managing the team, making sure that the implementation partner is not upset, ensuring that you are IRB compliant and ethics compliant. All those things we can basically get into those discussions, and people can reach out to me and talk to me if they want. But just as a starting point, if you're a PhD student, I would potentially say that work with your professors and advisors to get some experience, or reach out to people and work with them to get some experience. If you are an undergrad who is sort of interested in this, I would suggest that you apply for pre-docs and work with people so that you understand how to carry out these experiments. If you're a master's student sort of working on these things, you can talk to policymakers as well. There's a lot of information out there, but I think the best way of breaking this wall is to not just go head on and try to do things on your own without the experience that you want or the understanding that you may lack, is to just get your hands dirty and get your hands dirty in small bits and pieces. And that sort of opens up a lot of avenues, and then you can explore those.
People do have this hesitation to approach different individuals for understanding their work, but I think that's a very good place of approaching different things, because it a having ego would not help you, and undue pride would not help you, because you need help at the end of the day to get better at what you're doing. That community approach does help a lot. Your work has clearly highlighted that you have experiences with cross-disciplinary research and collaborations. How do you approach these cross-disciplinary research collaborations, and especially considering that you're spanning across such broad networks in terms of, say, project scope, and also in terms of the space that you're in and different countries that these individuals might live in, or different fields that they are engaged in? And how do you sort of work around that?
I think the best way of thinking about this is till the time you're curious and you're open to answering questions one way or another, these relationships will naturally form. So, most of my projects that I work on right now actually started off with here's a random idea that we discussed while having coffee. And a lot of time you're having coffee with folks that are doing economics, and a lot of times you're having coffee with folks who are not doing economics. And the idea is that if both people are interested in pursuing a question, then you can actually join your levels of expertise and your areas and domains of expertise. And what ends up happening from there is you have a more holistic approach, and that opens up more questions that you want to answer later on. That opens up more collaborations, and then you go ahead and like talk about these collaborations and these projects, which attracts and garners more interest, and then you start making more connections. So it kind of snowballs. You need to just like start, and that this kind of outcome that you see is an outcome over 8 years of me doing research. It did not happen like yesterday. And slowly relationships build, networks develop, and you start projects and you start finding interests on those lines.
Perfect. So, in case PhD students are approaching and developing, say, a job market paper, what advice would you probably give them to approach this?
Job market papers is a completely different beast that will probably take an hour of discussion. So if somebody is thinking about going on the market and
Hmm.
is working on specific topics, just reach out to me and I'll be more than happy to chat. But in terms of like just carrying out research, I think have an open mind. I remember seeing this somewhere on Twitter or Blue Sky, and it really stuck with me, which is in one of these PhD programs on the first day, one of the professors on the screen had this broad thing written, which is like, congratulations, all of you made it because you're smart, but now learn to be kind. And I think when you learn to be kind and when you learn to be open to opinions and understanding of ideas, you start realizing that there is a lot of knowledge that you don't have. And as soon as you start inculcating that, your projects, your understanding of the topics that you're working on becomes more nuanced. You're always open to criticism and reception of new ideas. And that sort of builds you up much better in terms of a researcher.
The next one is a bit of a two-pronged question, right? So, how do you really go about identifying, for example, education policy gaps or other gaps as research opportunities? You did walk us through the process of having these discussions and collaborative ventures with different individuals, and conversations have helped you do a lot of this work. But is there anything else specifically that you would say would help? And secondly, there have always been people who have this opinion that research is very divided from policy making, in the sense that policymakers are not really intertwined into how researchers are looking at different perspectives, and that there's this gap between policy implementation through, say, good research, because good research would eventually necessarily help policy making as well, because policy making becomes more efficient and outcomes become better. But there's this entire divide which is argued on a lot of spectrums. So how do you think that these issues can sort of be addressed?
You bring up a very important point, and I think to answer your first question about how do you find questions that you want to answer, it's primarily driven by discussions and keeping an open ear towards things that people have been talking about, reading articles in the news, reading other research papers, talking to people who are not only in your domain but also who are actually policymakers who are dealing with these problems in their everyday life, in their professional careers. And that's where a lot of things open up, and you're like, oh, these are the things that need to be improved. And you're totally right that there is a huge gap between what goes on in research and what gets implemented in policy. And I think as researchers, we need to be more cognizant about how we speak, what we write, and how we make our work more accessible to the general audience. And I think for that matter, blogs like the Development Impact at World Bank or some other blogs like Econ That Matters do a fantastic job of bringing this out for general audience and trying to show the relevance of the research that has been carried out. Now, whether that gets implemented in policy or not is a whole different discussion that we should probably have. And for there, collaborations between policymakers and researchers, and not short stints, but like long run collaborations, are super important to see findings that we basically get from our papers being implemented at scale. And I think there are organizations out there that are trying to do that now.
Just moving on to the final stretch, then, couple of things do come into mind when discussing developmental economics for you, right? So what do you think is the next thing that you want to work on right now?
I have a bunch of projects that I want to finish right now. I have projects both in the US and India that we are working on. But there are certain other things that we are sort of thinking about within the education space, not only dealing with students, but also with teachers in order in terms of improving teacher agency. So if you're ever interested in working on teacher agency and understanding what that looks like and how should we work on it, please talk to my brilliant friend Tarang. He's amazing and he has a bunch of cool ideas there. And we are planning to like take them forward in the future. But also there are other projects that we are sort of thinking about in terms of uncovering patterns in your preferences for managed markets, dating markets, which can have real life implications of how do individuals make choices. So fingers crossed you'll see something soon on those fronts as well.
Pretty interesting. So looking forward to that as well. Just the last thing. So just because you have mentioned that we are comfortable reaching out to you for your advice and help, where can we find your upcoming work or your, say, research? Is there any place which you would recommend the people to follow you on, or say reach out to you at?
So you can follow me on Twitter or Blue Sky, but if you just search for me on Google with my full name, Palaash Bhargav, with VA, the last A in my surname is silent, Bhargava. You'll find my profile, you'll find my website, and all my working papers and other selected work in progress is already there on the website, and it also has my contact information that you can use to reach out to me.
Perfect. So I'll be definitely sure to tag that down in the description when we do have this uploaded. I think, Palash, that's it. Thank you so much for joining in. It was a very interesting discussion about developmental economics and social networks in education, as well as talking about different narratives and cross collaborative research that you've done in climate and other departments as well. I think those insights would truly help a lot of people who are tuning in to listen to you. And we do hope to have you on board again sometime soon. Thank you so much for the great session.
Thank you so much. It was lovely being here, and thank you so much for this opportunity, Kaushik. It was fantastic talking to you.
Right. For any other details, please check the description. We'll add all of the relevant links to the documentations and other materials that we will be sharing with you. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone, as well. Hope to see you again soon.